Toronto's housing market is experiencing firsthand the negative side effects when your new housing supply is fueled almost entirely by investors. Eventually, prices get ahead of where they should be, the bubble bursts, and then sales plummet. And that's really where we're at today. And I'm going to be chatting a little bit about those and the dynamics and where we go from here in today's episode. My name is John Pasalis. My team and I help buyers and sellers throughout the Toronto area make smarter real estate decisions. If you'd like to meet with me and my team, you can just click the link in the show notes below or shoot me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com. So in today's episode, I really just wanted to expand on I'd say a mini rant I went on during our latest real estate roundtable with Steve Soretsky about Toronto's plummeting new condo sales, what's behind it, and what are the key factors, and what are the things that we need to be thinking about. And partly I wanted to expand on it because I think my perspective is a little bit different than what you see on Twitter, what you see in the news, what the academics tell you, what the policymakers are saying. Now, again, with new home sales plummeting in the Toronto area, and in particular new condo sales, everyone's looking for an excuse and an explanation for how we got here, why are sales plummeting, and what do we do to fix that? And everyone is zeroed in on pretty much the same thing: taxes. The taxes are just too damn high, and people can't afford to buy a home, and governments need to slash taxes so people can afford to buy a house. Now, there is some truth to that. Taxes are too high. The municipalities have used taxes on new housing as a bit of a cash cow. They've been increasing taxes at a faster rate than even home prices are appreciating to squeeze as much money out of our housing boom as possible. Federal provincial governments have not increased the exemption for HST limit, so that basically taxes over time are making up a much bigger share of new housing than they were 10 years ago. So yes, taxes should be lowered. They are too high. Having said that, taxes on new housing are not a new thing. It's not like we woke up in 2023 and all of a sudden taxes have exploded on new housing. The fact is, taxes on new housing existed when people were lining up and paying virtually any price for pre-construction condos in 2021, right? Taxes existed. Development charges were high. HST existed. These are not really new things. So if experts are going to lean on and blame taxes for this sudden decline in sales, well, we have to ask ourselves, how much of taxes really increased between 2021 and 2022 and 2023? Well, not that much, not enough to explain why sales have plummeted. I mean, it's not really, it doesn't really make sense. I'd say it's kind of intellectually dishonest to say all of a sudden taxes are too high and no one's buying. Now, it's also worth noting that many people, while they acknowledge interest rates are a factor, and obviously they are, the housing experts aren't blaming interest rates entirely, because if that was the case, new home sales will be plummeting everywhere across Canada, because of course interest rates are not tied to geography. And the reality is, in some markets, new home sales are doing well and construction is doing all right. So it's not just a story about interest rates, although interest rates do matter. Again, there's something more than development charges. And I think that the piece that is missing, of course, as I said in the startup of this episode, is that for years, Toronto had a housing market that's driven by investors. And one of the risks when you have a market that is dominated by demand from investors is that eventually prices can get ahead of where they should be. Eventually, irrational exuberance sets in. And when that happens, investors don't really care about what price the unit is at, because they just expect it to be higher tomorrow. And when that happens, of course, prices in the new housing market get ahead of fundamentals, get ahead of what is rational, and eventually the bubble bursts. And that is where we are. The reality is, for the rational buyer will not be paying $1 million for a 600 square foot pre-construction condo when they can get a very similar newly completed existing condo for 700 grand. I mean, the average person isn't paying $300,000 more for something that's pre-construction condo, when something that is brand newly completed today that's very comparable is $300,000 less. And yet that's what pre-construction investors were doing for years. They were doing that because they could leverage more. In many cases, they actually didn't have the down payment to buy an existing condo. So they had multiple years to save up their down payment. In some cases, they would borrow from their home equity line of credit for the down payment or for the pre-construction condo. So there are reasons why investors did this. Some of the other factors are many of the investors actually had no intention of even owning the condo. So it was a way to speculate in the market without actually even needing to get a mortgage. They just expected to flip it 2 or 3 or 4 years down the road. I mean, this obviously is the definition of a speculative market, when people have no intention and in many cases no means to even close on a property. It is a market that is fueled by speculation. And the downside, I mean, there are many downsides, but one thing is that, of course, when you have a market fueled by speculation and investors, it masks structural problems in the housing market. So if we didn't have such a dominant investor-driven boom in sales would have been softer years ago. And people have been looking at taxes and saying back then, okay, well, how do we adjust taxes? The city's ramping them up. We would have had a focus on the structural issues that are, constraining supply, because higher taxes on new housing, of course, does flow through to end users. But no one cared to look at that for years because, I mean, condo sales are surging. They're exploding. You don't really talk about high taxes in 2021 when people are lining up to pay $1,800 a square foot for a pre-construction condo in Toronto. You kind of gloss over that. You focus on other things. And that's one of the side effects. The other, of course, is today, the bubble burst and new home sales or new condo sales are plummeting. And of course, everyone is trying to scramble and find an excuse. Again, they're focusing on taxes, but obviously it's not just an issue of taxes. It is a typical trend that happens when housing bubbles surge for pre-construction housing. We've seen this in many markets around the world, and it's not really specific to Toronto. Now, I think one of the odd things or downsides is that so many people in Canada, so many academics, many of the academics who've been on this show are actually very big advocates of investors driving the majority of our condo sales, right? Many of them are big advocates of mom and pop investors, even corporations buying as many of our new homes as possible. Which is a very odd position, because when you have that, then as an academic, as a housing expert, you are kind of tacitly supporting what was a speculative bubble. I mean, at the end of the day, anyone in the housing industry looked at what was going on in pre-construction and knew that this wasn't rational. I mean, you didn't need a PhD to know that this wasn't rational. And yet the PhDs were largely supportive of a condo market that was driven by speculation, by irrational exuberance, where the prices didn't make sense. They didn't really care. And now that we have the hangover of the crash, they're trying to find something to blame. And the reality is, what experts should be looking at is how their own misguided advocacy that effectively puts the financial interests of investors ahead of end users that help fuel a bubble, why that misguided approach kind of got us to where we are today. And again, I think that is a mistake that most housing advocates, most housing experts, I think miss, and I think we need to reflect on. Now, the housing experts and academics and all of them will probably turn around and say, well, we're big advocates of investors because it creates rental supply. I mean, this is, something I hear all the time. It's hard to articulate how terrible that position is, because the reality is the right way to build rental supply is not having investors buy up as many of our existing and new homes that are intended to be owner occupied as possible. The right way to build rental supply is to build permanent rental housing. This is why in Canada, we track which share of homes are permanent purpose-built rental, which ones are supposed to be end user owner occupied housing. So the right way to build rental housing is to build permanent rental housing, both market rate housing and ideally non-market, where more rates are the rents are more affordable. The right way to build rental housing is not to have, mom and pop investors competing with families, because the reality is, it doesn't matter which bubble expert you want to read, whether it's Schiller or Kindleberger or McKay. At the end of the day, speculative bubbles are driven by the demand and the exuberance of investors. They're not driven by the housing needs of moms and dads with strollers, right? So when you have experts advocating for an investor-driven new housing market, they're again advocating for what might happen, which is a speculative bubble. And this is, again, one of the odd things about Canada's housing market. So many experts actually kind of were driving us down that direction. And the negative side effects, of course, of an investor-driven market, which I don't know if I want to get into all of them today, is not just what we're seeing today, where you have a pre-construction bubble and the bubble bursts. The other negative side effects are what people are seeing, experiencing on the ground. When you have professors and academics putting the interests of investors ahead of families, they're crowding out the next generation of buyers out of buying a home. They're putting the financial interests of the people who can afford to own multiple properties, the real estate income trusts who want to buy blocks of multiple properties. They're putting their interests ahead of sort of the next generation of families that want a home of their own. And I think these two things are at odds. At the end of the day, it is a zero-sum game. For every, 100,000 homes that are bought by investors, and right now in Canada, 100,000 homes are actually not just owned by investors, they're actually being used permanently as Airbnbs. We have CMHC saying, well, that's a good thing. Let's not have families owning those properties full time. We should just keep them as Airbnb investments. And I don't mean short-term Airbnb. I mean 12 months out of the year, basically Airbnbs. And again, I think this is the challenge we have in housing. Canada's academics, Canada's CMHC, like many of them are advocating for homes as a financial asset, as an investment to enrich the people who have the means to buy them. And of course, that crowds out the next generation of home buyers. This is why our home ownership rate in Canada is actually declining, because fewer people can actually buy a home, and more homes are going into the hands of the few rather than to the many. And I think this is where I think myself and I have quite obviously a very different position from where we're going from most housing academics. Our vision of the future is fundamentally very different for where I think our country should be going and what I think is socially right for the next generation. So that's a little bit about the housing market, the pre-construction market. And before I wrap up, I think I just want to say one more thing, because I think in the world of Twitter and YouTube, there's zero nuance. Everyone's like, am I blaming investors? I'm not blaming investors. I think every investor, it's irrational to blame investors for wanting to make money. Everyone wants to invest their capital. Investors are not they're not to blame. Every housing market needs a certain number of homes bought by investors. It's very normal and healthy, because not everyone can own and not everyone can move into a purpose-built rental. The challenge is not that we have some investors. The challenge is that they are the dominant buyers of new homes, both condos and low-rise homes. They're the biggest share. They're the type of home buyer whose market share is actually increasing over time, while first-time buyers is actually declining. These dynamics are not great. Okay, so it's not that we have investors, it is that the pendulum has swung so far into the investors' favor at the expense of first-time buyers. And I think that is the issue. We're not going to ban investors tomorrow, but we have governments and academics advocating for making housing this lucrative financial asset for REITs and for mom and pop investors, which is crowding out first-time buyers. And I think that is the problem when you have policymakers and advocates effectively putting the financial interests of investors first, and then the families are kind of a distant third or fourth, in the list of housing priorities. And I think that is the problem. When you put the needs of households, both households that will rent permanent rental housing and eventually home buyers, first, your market looks quite different. It doesn't look like what it looks like today. And I think, again, this is largely driven by the vision that most advocates are putting forward and the vision that our government is leaning towards. And I think it's not a great vision. I think we've seen many of the negative side effects over the past 15 years of the direction we're going in. And I think it's something I'm going to be writing about more in the future because I think it is the wrong path that Canada's on. And I don't think it gets fixed just by building more homes. I mean, this has been a myth that academics have been pumping for 5 years, which quite frankly made our housing market worse, pretending that we can build enough homes for 1.3 million people per year. Again, these are myths that experts have been putting forward. Pretending that our housing market is just a supply problem. We don't need to worry about who's buying homes and let the investors buy up all the stock they want. Again, is part of the problem with how one of the reasons why we got to where we are today. And something hopefully I'll be spend some more time on over the next couple of months to write a little bit more on and unpack in a little bit more detail. Anyway, I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below or shoot me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com.